This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Alright, let's carry on. Before lunch we dealt with the loss problem. Let's look at example B, which is the other problem, the work in progress. Let's try and be as efficient as we can. It should be revision. This time there are no losses. The basic idea is the same, that we want to know primarily a cost per unit. It's total cost divided by units. However, a few things here. First of all, remember there are two ways you could be asked to do it. This question, for the moment, although I will add a bit after, this question says FIFO, or first in, first out. So I'll remind you what the other way is after, but Laura, FIFO, first in. Okay, sorry, you looked excited by it. Hello, Katerina. I should hope so. Fine, well, I'll say the basic idea, cost divided by units, but a couple of things. First of all, and sorry, I do apologise, to ask you to do the whole thing here is possible, but unlikely, because there's a bit too much for 2 marks. But any bit of what we're doing certainly can be asked, and almost certainly will be asked. I think you understand me. But it can be any bit of what follows. Obviously we're going to do the whole thing. The first thing, and this could be a question on its own, is make sure you sort out the units. Make sure you're clear what's happening to all the units. It tells us during the month we started 6,000. However, at the start of the month we'd already some part finished units, work in progress. And at the end of the month there is some in progress as well. How you do these workings is your choice. I always do it this way. I do a little T account for it in units. And the point is, at the beginning of the month we'd work in progress of 400 units. I'm writing in dollars for the moment, in units. And appreciate what it is. It means there were 400 units there which we'd started last month. They're waiting to be finished. We're going to finish them this month. It also tells us in the first line that during this month we started some new ones, 6,000. And so we're hoping to finish 6,400. And remember, one of two things happens. Either they're finished and they leave the process, or some of those 6,400 are still not finished at the end of the month. There'll be work in progress at the end. Well, you must make sure you can sort out what's happened to them. Here they've told us the work in progress at the end of the month. So at the end of the month there are 600 still waiting to be finished. And therefore, since we were working on 6,400, the missing figure must be the finished ones. The missing figure, 5,800. And as I say, that could be a question all by itself. If you've understood me, a relatively easy one, but even so. Are we all happy with step 1? If they do want to carry on and do the costing, for reasons I'll remind you in a moment, you must work out how many units are done completely this month, this period. Again, be clear what I'm asking. We know how many units we started this period, but not all of them were finished. We know how many units were finished this period, but some of them were started last month. We need to know how many were started and finished this month. Anybody? How many units did we start and finish this month? 5,400. I think she's right. Remember, you can get the same figure two ways and it doesn't matter which. We know how many were finished. It was what? 5,800? However, some of those 5,800 had already been started last month. The opening work in progress was how many? 400? They were part of the 4 or 5,800 that were finished, but only the remaining 5,400 were started and finished this month. Alternatively, it's up to you. We know how many we started this month. It was 6,000. They weren't all finished. At the end, 600 were only part finished, the work in progress. And so again, 5,400. Don't do it both ways in the exam, for heaven's sake. Be happy with both, but whichever's the most obvious at the time. Alright? I'm about to remind you why we need it, but once we've got that, then we can go into our costings. And although again, it's your choice how you do your workings, but I still think my layout is the best. We have to deal with each bit of cost separately. And here it says the expenditure during the month. With expenditure on materials and on labour, I would do it in columns. Have a column for each cost. There could be a third, there could be overheads. Same principle. We're going to get cost by dividing total cost by number of units. If it's first in, first out, the cost is always what you spent this month. And it tells us at the end of the question, materials we spent 30,000. Labour we spent 18,120. For each of them to get cost per unit, we're going to divide by units. But, and the more you see the logic, the easier to remember, you say to yourself, what did you spend this month's money on? The first thing you did, you finished the opening work in progress. Check that I'm getting the right figures, but I think there were 400 of those. So some of the money was spent finishing those 400. We then did some units completely, start to finish. We just worked out that we produced, was it 5,400 completely? Hello? Nobody's helping me. Thank you, Laura. I'm glad somebody's here. So we spent money finishing the year opening. We then spent money doing those from beginning to end. And then we spent some money starting the closing work in progress. Of which there were how many? 600. However, the bit to be happy about is when we finish the table. I'm going to do labour first. For labour, we did spend money finishing those 400. But if you look at the question, it says the work in progress at the start, labour was already 30% complete. And so this month, we only had to do the remaining 70% of the work. And we say that 70% work on 400 units is the same as full work on 280. Now you're all staring at me as though you've never seen this in your life before. Maybe I've made a mistake, in which case I'd be grateful if you shouted. No, I haven't made a mistake. The work in progress at the start of the month, there were 400. It tells us in the question that at the start of the month, for labour, they were 30% complete. If we'd already done 30% of the work last month, this month, we only had to do the remaining 70% of the work. And again, 70% of the work on 400 units, we say, would have the same cost as doing full work on 280. All right? Still on labour, we then made 5,400 in full, so they'd have had the full cost of labour. But finally, we spent some money doing 600 units work in progress. For those 600, how much work was done this month, please?
60.
Yeah. By the end of the month, we'd done 60% of the work, the question tells us. And again, 60% work on 600 units. We say would have the same cost as full work on 360. And so, that 18,120 effectively was as though we were doing how many full units? 285, 4, 360. 6,040. Oh. And therefore, for labour, the cost per unit this month, divide 18,120, 6,040. Check me please, I think it's $3 a unit. Now again, you're going to have to help me because you're all putting those funny faces.
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Oh, good. Sorry. I thought you were going to say, yes, we're pulling funny faces. No, when I say help me, I mean, my number's right. But, don't just copy it down and smile. If it doesn't make sense, shout. Nobody's shouted. We'll carry on. But exactly the same for each cost, however many there are. The reason I left materials to second is simply because, hopefully, that's a lot quicker. But in the same way, the first place we spent money was finishing those 400. How much work needed doing this month, please? Nothing, because the brought forward, it was already 100% complete. We'd done all the work last month. There was no extra work this month. The units we did in full, the 5,400, at full cost, full work. But finally, the closing work in progress for materials, how much had we done this month? How much work was done this month on those 600? 100%. And of course, 100% work on those 600. 600. And so, equivalent 6,000 units at a cost of 30,000. The cost of materials per unit, 30,000 over 6,000. $5. As I've already said, there's no quick way. You have to do each cost separately. But as a result, the total cost this month of a finished unit is $8. Now, I said before, to actually do the whole thing is very unlikely. But there's another bit that will be tested on in some way or another. As always, it's up to you to shout. If you're not seeing the logic, shout. Otherwise, clearly it's just speed. One thing, and it is important, or could be terribly important. Can anyone remember these units, the 6,000 and 640? Well, I won't waste time, who can remember? We call those equivalent units. And you'll see when you come to do a test, but one way, quite likely, they'll have a little extract, is instead of asking you to do the full costing, they might simply say, what are the equivalent units for labour? You know, and they're just testing it on that bit of it. Okay? Secondly, materials, unless you were told different, you always assume that materials, they always have the full amount the minute you start the unit. So materials would always be 100% complete unless they said different. Am I making sense? So in this question, even if I hadn't mentioned anything about materials completing, you would have assumed it's 100%. You know, in all cases. Alright, well, again they might just ask that. The final bit though, they could ask you about valuations. In that, they could ask for either or both of. If you remember when we looked back at the very beginning, we decided that 5,800 units were finished and that 600 were in progress. You could be asked to value either of those. So first of all, let's value the finished units. Remember, in total, what was the total? Was it 5,800 were finished? 5,800? No, in total. I think in total 5,800 were finished. Yeah. Well, do remember, and again, although you don't waste time thinking in the exam, if you see the logic, it makes it easier to remember. Although most of the units were actually made this month, and this month they cost $8 each, the first 400 of the units, we'd actually spent most of the money last month when prices could have been different. We only had a bit extra this month, if you're with me. And so we have to value the two bits separate. First of all, the 400 that were the opening work in progress. I say again, most of the money on these was spent last month. So already spent. Look at the question. The opening 400, it said materials was valued at 1,600. Labour was valued at 240. We'd already spent 1,840 last month starting these units. However, we spent a bit more this month to finish them. We need to add on what we spent this month to finish. How much did we spend on materials finishing them? 0, thank you. They were already 100% finished, so we didn't need to spend any more. it was labour that wasn't finished. And check I'm picking the right figures. But labour, this month we had to do the remaining 70% of the work. So on those 400 units, 70% work to finish them. And so 70% of this month's cost, which for labour was $3. So I say if we had to do 70% work, we'll charge it at 70% of the cost. So the labour cost of finishing, I think, comes to $8.40. Total $2,680. So that's how much the first 400 ended up costing. However, the remaining 5,400, they were all made this month, and so they'll all be charged at this month's cost. Was it $8? I think I've got it right. But it means the total value of the finished ones, $45,880. Okay? Alright, well, again, the chance of asking for both is almost impossible, but alternatively, they could ask you to value the work in progress at the end of the month. How many were there? Was it 600 units? Well, you're going to do it, but remember, always we assume the closing work in progress. It was all started this month, so it'll all be at this month's costs. But if it's only half finished, it'll be half cost, and so on. You'll have to do the two separately, but can you work out the materials cost, the labour cost, and therefore the total? Again, this month's costs, but if it's half finished, it's half cost, etc. All right. So I'm sorry, it's in a sense messy because they're all the little steps. It is practice. All I can do is go through an example, and as I keep saying, you've got to shout if you lose one. But it is then a question of, well, obviously learning the rules and practice. All right? Alright, well, as those of you here were aware, although I'd love to shut up now and let you practice, I'm afraid we are going to do B all over again. Because I did remind you at the beginning, there are two ways they could ask you to deal with it. Not in the same question, but this way was first in, first out. Where I hope clearly the first thing we did was finish those 400, then we did 5-4, and then we started some more. The other way is weighted average, which is actually slightly quicker. So it won't take us very long. I'm going to repeat the whole question using weighted average. If you are copying it down, obviously make sure you sort of headed up which bit, then you don't get confused when you're looking back. I say it won't take us very long, so try and stay awake. This is why I said no alcohol over lunch. Those of you who did and who are dying to go to the toilet, tough. You ox. Let's do it. I'm not going to repeat every step, it's not needed. The one big thing that changes is the costings. Let's repeat our costings, and then again you're going to do the valuing. As before, same basic idea. Have a column for each cost. Here, materials, labour. But the one big difference is that last time we worked out on its own how much we were spending per unit this month. This time we take all the costs of all the units we're dealing with. What I mean is that as before, spent this month was how much? 30,000 on materials, 18,120 on labour. And again, last time that was all we looked at. However, we'd also spent a bit last month on that work in progress that ends up being finished this month. And so you also bring in the amount spent on the opening work in progress. And if you look back at the question, on the work in progress, it tells us that we'd already spent on materials from the question 1,600. And again, from the question, we'd already spent a bit on labour on those units. It was 240. So although obviously most of the money was spent this month, there was that little bit spent on those units. And so the total that's been spent, 31,600 on materials, 18,360 on labour. When we come to do our equivalent units, again, a rule's a rule, but see the logic. You see, last time we only looked at this month's money. And of course, this month's money, it only included finishing those original 400. But we've now got that 240, which was the cost of starting the original 400. And so we've now got all the costs of those original 400, as well as the 5,400 we did in full. And so included there, you've got the full cost of all the finished units. If you check back, there were 5,800 finished in total. Those cost figures include all the costs of those 5,800. Even though a bit was last month, most was this month, it's got the full cost. The bit that doesn't change, though, is of course you have only got the cost of starting the closing work in progress. Of which there were 600. We've only got the cost of starting them. Obviously, if they're not finished, we can't only have spent money on the work that's been done. How much work had been done on materials? 100%, so the full 600. But on labour, by the end of the month we've only done 60% work, equivalent to 360. So before we finish it off, I hope I've made sense. The big change is this. With FIFO, you only take this month's expenditure. With weighted average, you bring in the amount on the work in progress. And because of that, we've got all the finished units, all the cost of the finished units. Finishing it off now is quick. The cost per unit, as usual, we divide. So materials 31.6 over 6.4 comes to what? To the nearest cent, is it $4.94, please? Oh. Oh, thank you. In the exam, because they'll only want it one way, it will almost certainly divide exactly. If it doesn't, don't panic. Do it to the nearest cent. All right? Similarly, for the labour, 18,360 in total, 6,160 units. Comes to how much? Again, to the nearest cent, I think $2.98. I'm not going to wait for anybody to check me. And as a result, the total unit cost is what? $7.92, I think. Again, you won't be doing it both ways, so you won't be able to compare. Here we have the cost per unit's a bit less than last time, but it's because costs last month were perhaps a bit cheaper than costs this month. I don't really care. Finally, though, the valuations. I'll do one, you do the other. First of all, what is so much easier here is the finished units. Last time was a slight problem. You were keeping the old ones separate from the new ones. But on this approach, they'll all be valued at the same average cost. 5.8 were finished at $7.92 a unit. The total cost is $45,936. And finally, the closing work in progress, the 600. Well, as always, if the half-finished, half-cost business, but we'll use these average costs. So can you work out, please, what is the value of the 600 work in progress? What's the materials bit? What's the labour bit? Again, there is a bit of rounding here, obviously, which is extremely unlikely to be needed in the exam. But otherwise, I hope no problem. Closing work in progress, same idea as always. Part finished, part cost. But this time we're using these weighted average costs. Okay? So, I'm sorry it's messy, it's not my fault. Just a couple of final things. I mean, I have already said the chances of being asked the whole thing are very tiny indeed. But any one bit of that can be tested to make sure. Alright? Secondly, although you have the two problems, losses and work in progress, you can never have both in the same question. In real life you can, and it's horrible, but in the exam they've said each one will either be a problem on the losses before lunch or a problem on work in progress after. And finally, if it is a work in progress problem, I've kept saying they would never ask for it both ways, but obviously for any costings you will need to check. Do they want it first in, first out? Do they want it weighted average? You'd agree? I mean, it sounds too obvious, but I think I mentioned before, it's astonishing in the real exam how many people it specifically says do FIFO and they go and do weighted average and it'll be one of the answers. Or it says weighted average and they do it the other. You know, for heaven's sake, remember which is which. It's a silly place. But also, do note, you've not much choice here, but do note, it's only a problem when there is opening work in progress. You don't need to really write this down, but if there were no opening work in progress, there's nothing been spent on opening work in progress, clearly. And if there's no opening work in progress, that 400, I mean, all that, you'd only have the finished ones, if you're with me. What I'm trying to get at, if there is no opening work in progress, they don't need to tell you whether it's FIFO weighted average, because they both give, it'll be exactly the same either way. If I'm not making sense, think about it later, ask me. But if they don't tell you FIFO or weighted average, it'll be because there is no opening work in progress. Both would give the same answer, and in both cases it's quicker. You know, a line's missing. Alright?